name is Jerome Page, and I'm a consultant for the Humanities DC. The Humanities DC has an initiative called the DC Living Heritage Network, and we'll be hearing more about the DC Living Heritage Network today. The DC Living Heritage Network was formed in 2014 to bring together groups who are operating the humanities, heritage, and preservation space in the District of Columbia in order to ensure that their voice, their interests, their issues are included in the conversations around culture and preservation in the District of Columbia. So the theme of this year's activities have been best practices for groups who are engaged in humanities, heritage, and preservation. I'll talk about that a little bit more later when Joy and I come up after the speaker, Ed Lazier. This is our fourth annual workshop. The first one was in 2014, and the key theme there was we all thrive when heritage is alive. And the purpose of that workshop was to talk about ways in which groups can collaborate, groups that share a common mission, purpose. The second workshop was called Cultural Inclusion, and that focused on the role that humanities, heritage, and preservation should play in the then upcoming request for proposal for doing a cultural plan, and then subsequently the cultural plan. That was 2015. Based on the work of the DC Living Heritage Network, there were significant revisions in the RFP to make sure that the cultural plan was fully representative of the concept of culture and include as many groups as possible. In 2016, we focused on what should go in the cultural plan from the perspective of heritage preservation and humanities. We made several recommendations, and along with other groups. And as I indicated, this year, 2017, we've been focusing on best practices for organizations, particularly small nonprofits. I'll talk about a little bit more today. Later this in the program. To round out our discussion of best practices, we've invited Ed Lazier here, and we'll be talking about that after I introduce him. So I'll turn it over to Joy Austin, who's the Executive Director of the Humanities DC. Thank you.
Thanks, Joy. Okay, well, I want to welcome all of you here. And Jerome gave you a nice quick synopsis of the work that we've been doing for 4 years now. And I want to particularly say that each of you, and I've seen most of you at our events, should stay encouraged about the work that you're doing. It's really important. It's very significant now and into the future. So please stay encouraged. I encourage you also to read the little brief piece that Jerome has made, not now, but when you have a moment, because it gives you a sense of this movement and this network. And beyond our numbers, we have had impact. I think that you will see that impact when the cultural plan comes out. But you see it, for example, as Lydia just pointed out, in the ads that are coming out on for the lottery campaign, for example, straight out of the ideas in the heads of people in this room in terms of focusing on neighborhood heritage. So there are lots of ideas being seeded, and I encourage you. Jerome is our historian, and of course he's our great intellectual interpreter, and we would not have been able to put together the ideas that we have put together and seeded and put out there, both at the city council level and at the and in the cultural plan and across the city, if we hadn't had this kind of good intellectual heft and discussion going forward. So I encourage you guys to stay involved with us. And one of the things that I'm very happy about is that we are going to be shifting slightly, even more so, into advocacy and into the idea that into communications. And so who better to have today to help us to frame our advocacy efforts, to encourage us to understand better what is required than Ed Lazier. Now here is the head of the DC Fiscal Policy Institute, thinking enough of the work that the DC Living Heritage Network is doing to come with all of his formidable abilities to examine the DC government and examine the DC government's budget and constantly and annually make that city government and that city council adjust to what is needed and necessary for all of the citizens of the district. So I'm going to ask Jerome to more formally introduce him. I am very glad to see you guys, and I ask you to stay encouraged and stay with the DC Living Heritage Network. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, Joy, you did the introduction, but I don't know what else to add to that. I was looking at Ed's Twitter feed, and he said he's a proud DC resident, a parent, executive director of DC Fiscal Policy Institute, and a baker. So you're not baking anything today, but yeah, Ed, if you go to the DC Fiscal Policy website, dcfpi.org, you'll see his full bio. He's the first and only executive director of the DC Fiscal Policy Institute. The DC Fiscal Policy Institute got started 16 years ago. We just had our 16th anniversary, because I was on the founding advisory board of the DC Fiscal Policy Institute and have continued to serve on the board. So Ed and I have come along together, but he's outstripped me. Typically when I go in front of groups, I say, I give my background on this, on that, and then I say I'm on the advisory board of the DC Fiscal Policy Institute. Everybody says, Ed Lazier, yes. Yeah. So his work is known, not just his work personally, but the work of the organization. We're proud of them, and we're glad to have him here to speak today on the role of advocacy, and he's going to share experiences of the DC Fiscal Policy Institute, how they put together what we call campaigns in order to influence policy in the District of Columbia. So Ed, please join us.
Right. Well, good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.
Nice to see you all here. I'm going to maybe, if I can maneuver here and get the mic in the right spot. Well, it's very nice to be here. Nice to see you all. Thank you so much, Jerome and Joy, for having me. And Jerome, for all you do for the DC Fiscal Policy Institute for all these years. It's nice to see some familiar faces, but also some new faces as well. So I will tell you a little bit today about the DC Fiscal Policy Institute and the work we do, and some of the advocacy that we've been able to accomplish. But I do just want to start by doing a shout out to you all, to the Living Heritage Network, because in reading through the materials to get ready for this meeting, it's very touching, I guess, and very impressive to see what you're trying to do. That cultural heritage and preserving cultural heritage in a city that is changing as rapidly as DC is really important. We at the DC Fiscal Policy Institute focus on trying to preserve the economic diversity of the city through things like affordable housing and investment in schools, and I really see very much what you're doing through trying to do cultural preservation and heritage preservation is just it's a nice complement or corollary to what we're doing at the DC Fiscal Policy Institute. And so I'm going to tell you today about the work that we do to engage in advocacy, and maybe first I'll just tell you a little bit about what we do at DCFBI for those who don't know us. So our mission is to improve the conditions for DC residents through investing in things that will help low-income residents meet their basic needs, like housing and healthcare and nutrition, but also things that will increase economic opportunity for DC residents through investments in job training, adult education, early education, and K-12 as well. And we do that work through research and advocacy. We're not a direct service provider. We do research to talk about the challenges facing DC residents, like the loss of affordable housing, or an economic recovery that's not reducing unemployment fast enough in the Black community. And then we work with partners to devise strategies to address those challenges, often through the city's budget. Where do we need to spend more money? Where are we spending money the wrong way? But also, how do we design programs to be more effective? So we do this combination of research and advocacy. And in getting ready for this event, I've told most of you here know DC government pretty well and have done some advocacy as well. You know that we never get anything without asking, and that you have to ask it in an organized way and a concerted way, and be persistent and flexible. And that's what we try to do at the DC Fiscal Policy Institute. And I'm going to go through some examples of some of the successes we've had. In essence, what I'm going to try to do is give you our best tips, all that we do when we have set a goal to figure out how to try to accomplish it. So it was a little bit of an exercise. This is probably the first time I have sat down and said, well, what are our best tips for achieving the goals we want through advocacy? So I'm sharing with you some top secret information that I've never shared with anyone before. Are you ready for that?
Yes.
All right. And I did it in a handout that I gave to Lewis. I don't know if it's been distributed to you. You can, yeah, 2 pages. You can walk along. So it is top secret, but now it's in your hands. So if you want to, share it with the world, that's fine as well. I would say that you guys already have some success, right? In reading through materials, you were able to convince the city that a cultural plan is not just arts focus, right? You were able to convince them to pass legislation to require a cultural plan and help define what would be in the RFP, and got positive feedback from the Office of Planning. So it feels like you already are there. You know the key council members who are involved and the key DC government agencies. So you're advocates already, and you've already had some success. And now the question is, what can I do to teach you to be even more successful? So I'm going to focus on 3 broad things that we think about when we're doing advocacy campaigns. And you can read through here, and I thought I would hand it out in case you wanted to take notes. But these are things that I think are critical to the success and advocacy that we have. So the first is having a robust coalition or network. The second is having a good message and good messaging materials. And then the third, maybe the most challenging and tough, is having a range of tactics. And the way I say it is to create a sense of urgency and importance, or creating a buzz. You want policymakers to think your issue is important and everyone's talking about it, even if it's really just you all and you're just creating this illusion in some ways that this is the most important issue, because that's what you need to do. So that stakeholders and policymakers feel like, of all the things that they're hearing about, your issue is the one that they need to respond to. You also need to be patient and flexible. A lot of what we do is try one tactic, and when that doesn't work, we move on to another, and then another, until you hit the one that works. And with different policymakers, you might find one tactic works and another policymaker's another, so you just need to make sure you load up your toolbox as much as possible. You need to be patient, because it takes time. You can have the best advocacy and win overnight, and you can have the best advocacy and keep trying year after year after year and not win. It's not necessarily, because these are decisions made by policymakers that aren't always in your control. So don't think that because you're not winning that you're not having an influence, you're not making progress. It just isn't always work that way. I would also say that what I'm going to go through is a long list of things, and for any individual advocacy campaign that I've been part of, we've never done all of them, because it's just really time intensive and energy and resource intensive. So I'm giving you what I think are some of the key tips, and it's really going to be up to you all and any advocacy you do to figure out what are the most important and strategic things for you to do among these various options. And given that you've already got the handout here and I'm going to be walking through it, I think it's probably best as we go along, if there's something that you are curious about that you've tried or you want me to explain a little bit more, it's totally fine to raise your hand and do a little Q&A as we go along, as long as you're not interrupting me every 3 seconds, and that we'll just take questions at the end as well. All right, so let's talk about having a network, your coalition, the number of partners. So the answer here is actually that you can succeed with a really small coalition, and sometimes you can have a really large coalition. So one example is 2 years ago, we worked with 3 or 4 other partners, some labor unions and the Legal Aid Society and us, and maybe that was it, to point out that the city hadn't raised its unemployment benefits in 10 years, and that our unemployment benefits were among the lowest in the country, and within 6 months we had success with 4 partners. And that's a rare moment of really rapid success. Another example is the campaign around paid family leave that I'm sure you're all familiar with. which is getting a lot of attention and has hundreds, literally hundreds of organizations and members who are part, and has had 2 or 3 years worth of advocacy. So you don't have to have a lot of folks, but the more you have, the better. So as long as you have a core of committed folks, that is a good start. I think it's always good to think about broadening your coalition. And as I was reading through your materials, I just threw out some quick ideas. I have no idea if these fit for you, but you talked a lot about youth. So are there youth groups that you connect with? So Critical Exposure, for example, gets teenagers to do photography to talk about what's going on in their communities. That seems to be cultural heritage to me. Or DC Scores, which does uses adolescents to do poetry and talk about what's going on in their lives. Or a Black Youth Project. Or businesses, that would be another. There's of course a large coalition of small local businesses, the Think Local First Coalition, who presumably are very interested in figuring out how they can preserve the heritage in their community, but also ways that their business can take advantage of, particularly if they've been a business that's been around for a while, to succeed by supporting things that are a cultural plan and the things that would come out of that. I'm hoping you're reaching out to community-based groups, and so much of cultural preservation is going to be neighborhood-based, and that's what you talked about in your materials, so ANCs or civic associations, and of course religious institutions are a big part of cultural heritage as well, so I'm hoping you're reaching out to folks like that. So the more that you can have conversations with folks, even if it's just, will you put your name as a member of this, of the Living Heritage Network, the more names you have and you can share with policymakers, the more impressive you'll be. Regardless of its size, I think you're going to want to always have a leader. So I don't know if Jerome and Joy, you feel like you guys are the ones who are making it happen, but as you can probably imagine, if there is a group of folks who are responsible, but no one person is responsible for the next meeting, when are we going to set our goals, when are we going to plan, who we're going to meet with in the city council, if you don't have someone who's at least making those conversations happen, it's hard to move things forward. We tend to have in the advocacy we work on, also a steering committee. So you might have a coalition of 100 members, but a steering committee of 8 members who are the ones who are coming together, who are making the most important decisions. And I think that's also important to being efficient, as long as you're doing it in a way where everyone coming to that table has some ownership, shares the same interests, and is willing to share responsibility and don't feel like there's just any one person who's in charge. Yeah, and then the last thing I would say is that when we put together coalitions, we do look for groups that bring a diversity of interests or diversity of strengths. Do they represent different parts of town? Do they represent the business community versus the advocacy community? Are they a membership-based organization where they can bring people to tell their personal stories? Like in our unemployment insurance campaign, the labor unions were able to bring workers to talk about why they were not able to make ends meet on the city's low unemployment insurance benefits. All of those things, the more you can have partners who can bring different strengths to your coalition, the better. So maybe I'll take a break there and a deep breath. I'm talking fast maybe, and see if you have any questions about that.
Well, could you give an example of a campaign that you think would represent the sort of best practices in coalition building?
Sure. So let me think through which a recent campaign. So one.
Maybe you could use, you and I such campaigns, maybe you can share with the group the DCFPI campaign.
Yeah, so when I say campaign, it is, there's a group of individuals and organizations who come together with a specific goal. We want to change the legislation, we want to change how a certain agency is doing it's running its programs, we want to get more funding for something. We've set a collective goal and then we're going to try to be working towards it. So I'll give you a couple. As I said, when we were pushing for unemployment insurance reforms, it was a couple legal services organizations who had clients who were coming in and facing trouble paying their rents or their utility bills because they were unemployed and their unemployment benefits were so low. It was the unions who also saw unemployed workers coming in and asking for assistance from the union's charitable arm because their unemployment benefits were not enough. There was us as an organization that could do the research, not very complicated, but just to demonstrate that if you compared all states in the country, our unemployment benefits were in the bottom tier. And when you compared it to the cost of living, our unemployment benefits were among the worst. And that allowed us to put out really simple materials and fact sheets to document why this was a problem. Another example is a campaign we just completed this year to provide free public transportation to adults who are in adult education programs. So what we found out was that a lot of adults who've signed up for adult education, they're ready to better themselves, they want to do better for themselves and their children, etc. and then they miss class a third of the time because they don't have bus fare on any given day to get to their program. And that means that they might start a program and not complete it. They're not really fulfilling their dreams. It means the city's spending money on adult education that's actually not all that effective because people can't even get to the programs. We had a model in the city, as you probably know. We now have children get to ride free, and Mayor Bowser's been touting kids ride free as something to take credit for. So we said, if we're doing kids ride free, let's do adults ride free as well, to sort of build on the mayor's, what we thought would be, allow her to add her legacy around transportation and education. And so our coalition started with policy organizations like the DC Fiscal Policy Institute. It included a lot of adult education providers themselves who had students and they knew who were missing classes. And then we rounded it out with a lot of adults who were in education programs themselves who could come to a meeting with their council member because they live in that ward and could tell a very personal story, not the remote story that maybe a research organization could tell, or even that the adult education provider itself could tell. I'm trying to think if there are other examples. The Paid Family Leave Coalition is enormous in that it really includes lots of small businesses that would like to provide paid family leave but can't afford it now. It includes women's advocates, or organizations focused on women's issues, because they know that a lot of women, when they leave the labor market, when they have a baby, or have a hard time getting back in, and having paid leave when they have a baby would help them stay in the job market. It included other advocates on workers' issues who are concerned that too many people, when they need to take time from a job, either with the baby or with a sick relative, lose their job and can't get back into the job market. So it included a diverse range of organizations.
Just to follow.
Yeah.
What is DCFPI's role in the coalition?
So the role that we play in the coalition is multiple. So because we are a dedicated public policy organization, we just have basic things like we know the policymakers very well. We know every member of the city council. We know their staff. We know the policy process, so we can give advice on just how that's going to work. We know the budget process well, so we can sort of, if someone, the policymaker says, oh, we can't find money for that because this or that, we can come back and say, that's not really true. Here's where you can find the money, and it's a lot easier than you're thinking, because policymakers will tell you, oh, we just don't know where to find the money for that. That's their first defense, to try to get you to leave the room without them not satisfying your interest. We also can do research, so we can, as I said, put together a nice fact sheet to the extent that we're trying to make the case on one page about why we need public transportation for adults in education programs, or why we need to raise unemployment benefits. The fact that we can do relatively straightforward research and put it into some bullets and create a few charts, that's not something that every organization can do. And then the final thing that we contribute, that lots of other groups do as well, is just strategic advice. Having been through campaigns before, we sort of know what things have worked and what things haven't worked, so we can't just provide that, what if we try this, what if we try that? Oh, maybe the best thing would be to get an op-ed from someone in the business community, or maybe the best thing to do would be to make sure somebody is following the mayor around at every event she's going to be at that day and ask her about what she's going to do on this particular issue, or whatever it might be. So just that advice we have based on the experience of having been through campaigns.
So it's no secret that the arts and humanities organizations in the city are hoping that either through the cultural plan or the efforts of our advocacy efforts, that we will be able to locate dedicated funding, and as you just said, point out that there is. So how do you wrap your arms around this whole idea of where is the money and?
Sure. So you, for sure, if it hasn't happened already, if you've gone to a policymaker, someone in the mayor's office or the council, and you've made a pitch for something, and it's something that costs money, we want you to spend more money on X, you will get the question of, well, where should the money come from? And particularly if your request is not enormous and is a reasonable one and compelling, my advice is run away from that question as fast as you can, because it's not your job to find the money. You do not manage the city's budget. You don't know about public safety and education and public works. And it wouldn't really be appropriate for you to say, oh, I think you're spending too much on garbage collection, you should cut that, because why would you expect them to know that? It's their job, and I've seen it over and over and over again, that if you make a compelling case with a compelling number of people, and you've put enough political pressure on it that they see that it's important, they will find the money. So this year, for example, I'll give you one example. The mayor had proposed a budget that increased school funding by less than the rate of inflation. So really meaning that schools were not able to maintain what they were doing and keep the same number of teachers and other sorts of things that they would need to run their schools well. We had been, the DC Fiscal Policy Institute had been part of a working group that recommended a much larger increase in school funding. So there was this official report from the Office of the State Superintendent, this working group that had a number that was much larger, and so everybody in the advocacy community was able to rally around that, including parents, including advocacy organizations. And so this past spring, literally hundreds of people testified before the city council and said, the mayor only did this much for schools and this working group recommended this, we want this, and the council had really no choice but to find, they didn't get called right to there, but they got far closer there than the mayor had. And where they found the money is a bit of a mystery. They took a little bit here, a little bit there, they found efficiencies. They found the money because they felt that there was political pressure on them to do so. And to the extent that you're asking for a relatively small amount, I think the general answer that I give, maybe the short answer to your question, is just to say to the policymaker, we think this is important, we hope you will find it important, and we hope that you will find a way within the city's vast resources to fund this program, or just something generic like that. And you put it back on them because it's just not your job. And if you start recommending where to get cut, then you've been distracted from your most important issue, which is, this is what we want funded. Yeah. All right, we ready to move on? All right, so let's talk about materials, messaging and materials. So probably the most important thing to remember is that policymakers are dealing with hundreds or thousands of issues, lots of people coming to them with lots of things that they want, and I'm pretty confident that if you went to most policymakers on any given day on most issues before them, they really don't know them in great detail. And if you talk to them about a cultural plan, there will be a handful who know about it, but most of them will not. So what you need to do is educate them in as simple and quick way as you can, right? So we always assume that when we're going into a conversation with the policymaker, unless we've interacted with them a lot before, that we're sort of starting from scratch with them and explaining things. And not like they're in first grade, but don't presume that they know the acronyms, don't presume that they know that there was an RFP for a cultural plan or even what a cultural plan is. Like, start from that basic, and always have a one-page fact sheet that highlights and defines your key terms, says why what you're doing is important, says why what you're doing will make a difference for them or for the District of Columbia. We tend to try to make sure that those fact sheets hit a variety of different kinds of arguments, because policymaker A might be really interested in one issue, and policymaker B might be interested in the issue for a very different reason. So the more that you are covering a range of reasons why this might be important to an organization that's concerned about the black community and the fact that black people are being displaced from the city. The cultural plan might be interesting to someone who cares about economic development and business growth, right? It might be interesting to people for a variety of different reasons, and the more that your materials cover all of the different things that somebody might be interested in, the more likely you are to connect with every single policymaker, as opposed to arguments that all fall sort of along one dimension, which would convince some people and not others. I would also say, and I don't know if this is where it fits in my presentation, but I was going to say it later, I think I maybe was going to say it later, but also be prepared when you're preparing your arguments to don't fall in love with your arguments too much, right? You might go in and think that the most compelling point to make is X, that the reason that we need a cultural plan is this, and that actually may not be all that interesting to some policymakers. It may fall entirely flat, and don't be insulted by that. Just move on to your next argument until you find the thing that they are most interested in. And I'll give you an example from an advocacy campaign that we did years ago, where we were not all that happy that the city wanted to spend hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars on a baseball stadium, which we won before we lost, but that's history. We can talk about that later if you're interested in. And what we thought was the most compelling argument, as someone who focuses on economic research, was the economic argument, the economic research that says when you put in new baseball stadiums, it doesn't actually help the economy. You don't get more jobs, you don't get more income. Right, I see some nodding heads, it's compelling to you, da, da, da. Well, that, when we did polling, which is a rare moment where we did some polling, that argument people didn't care about that. They didn't believe that. They thought, brand new baseball stadium, 3 million people coming, it's gotta be good for the economy. The argument that was most compelling in our polling was that subsidizing a baseball stadium was giving money to billionaires who don't need it, which you could also see why that would be a compelling argument too, right? And so that's the message that we hit over and over and over again. We sort of dropped the economic development argument. We included it in our talking points, but in terms of what we emphasized in our testimony, in our interactions with policymakers, was more the thing that seemed to be most compelling. Again, because you shouldn't be in love with your arguments. You should be finding the arguments that resonate most with the policymakers.
So in hindsight, now that you have some perspective, what would you say were the compelling arguments now? Were they valid? Your objections? What is
the baseball stadium?
Yeah.
Well, so you're giving me the opening to say why we won before we lost. So we actually won, right? We had this ragtag group of about 100 people who were trying to, we didn't have a baseball team in DC, which for a lot of people was a big deal. And stadiums get subsidized everywhere. Major League Baseball was saying, we're not going to come if you don't do this. Mayor Williams supported it. Jack Evans supported it. And we put enough pressure on them that the council voted 7-6 that any stadium had to be half privately financed. And then, within 2 days, so the Expos were already playing in DC as whatever, they had made a full decision. And the owner of the Expos, the Montreal Expos, said, well, if you bought season tickets next year and you'd like to get a refund, we'll give you a refund. We're going to close down our merchandise shop, etc. Like, they just started making threats that they were going to be gone forever. And 3 days later, instead of 7-6, one person flipped their vote 7-6 to pay for the stadium. So we actually did win. Our arguments were successful. The pressure then became so great from this corporate entity and from the fact that the city might lose a baseball team that one person flipped their vote. But it was it was still just one person who flipped their vote. So in that case, that doesn't mean that we exactly had done everything right, but it does suggest that the arguments that we had raised were compelling.
So, what about the economic development piece? Was there economic development? I'm trying to go back to your arguments about.
Well, that would require a PhD economist, maybe Jerome or somebody to do an analysis of to confirm what happened. I mean, what I would like to say is, we built the Verizon Center and the baseball stadium, and people can point to the development that occurred around the baseball stadium. But I would make a number of arguments. One is, at the time that the stadium was being advocated for by the mayor, they would show maps saying, look at all the things that are coming to this part of town, and we've just got one hole here, and the stadium's going to fill the puzzle. So they already were acknowledging that development was coming themselves, right? So that's one. The second is that there's development that's popped up all over the city that has far, far away from the baseball stadium. You cannot say that what happened in this neighborhood has anything to do with the baseball stadium, right? Like, so the notion that the economic development that occurred around the baseball stadium was because of the baseball stadium, when there's development happening everywhere, there's just no basis to make that point. So what we've seen is developers are looking for places to develop. The baseball stadium, they knew they wanted to develop in DC, and the baseball stadium gave a nice reason to develop there, but they would have developed somewhere else if not there. And then the final thing is, again, if you look at what the city did, they opened up a metro station there, they invested a huge amount in Yards Park, the Department of Transportation project, Navy Yards. There's been so much other public money funneled into that area that the notion that the stadium is the reason for the development. And even if you go to Gallery Place, which is a hop-in area, now it's really just a hop-in area for a block or two. If you get 2 blocks away, there aren't that many restaurants, there's not that many people walking around, right? So anyway, yes?
Politically, what would you guys do differently? I mean, to get politicians, you had a really narrow win, one person, and then that person was. What would you suggest might be another, strategy to get a vote like that? Would be like 5-7 or something like that. What can you do with the political picture?
So I think that I do cover that sort of when I talk about the various tactics. So I think I'll try to answer that question a little bit later on. So I want to go through my notes here about the materials. So I have not seen in any of your materials like a one-page fact sheet yet. So if you don't have one yet, or why we need a cultural plan, and why we need funding, how much funding it needs, what that funding would accomplish, and why everyone in DC should support it, I think that would be a really useful thing, and be mindful of jargon or any terms that people may not, if it's a term that people may not know what it means, define what it means in pretty concrete ways. We often do develop internal talking points for when we're going to have conversations with policymakers or testify, so that everybody in our network is using the same key messages and their policymakers are hearing it over and over again. Policymakers, their materials should be very clear what policymakers should do. So in my experience and the advocacy that we've done, there are sometimes when policymakers will say, what I really think we need is X, and then they go ahead and pursue it. But more often than not, those signals come from the advocacy community. So when we expanded pre-K, and then Council Chair Gray and then Mayor Gray promoted expanding universal pre-K, it was a great idea, he owned it, but it didn't originally come from him. Another example is that 2 years ago, we partnered with DC Appleseed to do a report about childcare in the city, and about how we were so poorly funding our childcare program that infants and toddlers in low-income families were getting poor quality care, which affected their ability to start school ready to learn. It meant that childcare centers in low-income neighborhoods were going out of business, and we could document very clearly through research that what the city was paying those providers was far less than their cost. We also documented that it meant workers were making really low wages, and that they weren't staying on the job very long, and that we weren't using that tool to create better jobs for DC residents. We partnered with childcare providers themselves and with parents to do advocacy, and after 2 or 3 years, we've gotten to the point where everyone on the council knows that they need to invest in childcare. So there are now 2 bills before the council to invest in more in childcare. Mayor Bowser did something on childcare in her budget. 3 years ago, no one was talking about childcare, and thanks to the work that we and others did to start to create that attention, now they're talking about it. So I say all of that to say that policymakers are looking for things that they can own and take credit for and run for. So if you have a policymaker, whether it's Grasso or the mayor, who would love to say, and thanks to my efforts, I'm so proud that we now have a cultural plan and that we're investing in things that are going to do X, Y, and Z. If you spelled it out for them, that's terrific, right? Because they don't have a lot of staff, they don't have a lot of time, and so it's not exactly spoon feeding, but it's pretty close to spoon feeding, where you are giving them an idea, and obviously it has to be compelling to them. But the more specific you could be about how much money is needed and what it would go for and why it would make a difference and what arguments they could make when they're introducing the legislation, even drafting the legislation if you have that capacity, all of those things are really helpful. And I'll give you another example of that. So 3 years ago, homelessness has always been a huge issue in the city, and it has risen and fallen at various times. 3 years ago, the number of families experiencing homelessness just spiked like crazy. It went up by about 50% in just a couple of years. And we started seeing the numbers because the city does a daily census of the number of people seeking shelter. And honestly, we were not happy with how the city was responding. And in fact, the Gray administration, in part because they didn't want to respond and didn't have the resources to devote to it, started to find excuses and said, we don't have a problem with homelessness, we have a problem that too many people are seeking shelter. That was their answer. And they didn't have a clear sense of what to do. And so we pulled together about 24 organizations, and we wrote them a roadmap, and we called it the Helping Families Home Roadmap. We even called it a roadmap, and we said, here are 10 things you can do to address and help families who are becoming homeless, including more homeless prevention programs, changing our emergency rental assistance program, changing the way certain programs were administered, and again, that allowed the council and the mayor to both say, oh, here are things we can do. Within 2 months of that roadmap coming out from the advocacy community, the council had adopted portions and funded portions of it, including a program modeled from other cities, New York and a few other places, to help people who are about to face homelessness address whatever problem that they're facing, that has had a 90% success rate in keeping families out of shelter, a program that no one in the mayor's office or the council knew about until we brought it to their attention, and let them then create the funding for. So the more that you can spell out and give them a roadmap for what you want them to do, the more likely you are to get what you want. I think that sort of covers what I'm thinking about in terms of materials. If you have additional materials beyond a fact sheet, you can do a white paper, or if you have articles, news articles or research papers from other communities about what cultural plans have meant and what impact they've had, that's helpful as well. You don't necessarily need a lot. I'll pause there. Any questions about that? Yes.
We have a number of longer pieces. Listening to you talk, we probably need more shorter pieces.
You need to distill, yes. So, and I maybe even put this in my notes. Staff will read the things you give them. The council member staff or the mayor staff, somebody will read your materials, but not the council member themselves. And so to the extent that you want them to fully understand it, if you don't, you need a one-page fact sheet that sort of highlights what you want. And maybe multiple fact sheets on different parts of why a cultural plan is important and what's needed for just various audiences or whatever. But for sure, if you're handing somebody a 20-page document, it's not going to be as impactful as if you have that, even the same document with a one-page cover sheet.
Yeah, I'm thinking in retrospect when we did our second publication called Cultural Inclusion, the executive director or the director of the DC Office of Planning read the document, and he said it was mandatory reading for everybody. So that was a plus.
That's good.
But we didn't, and now in retrospect, we didn't have those one-page things to accompany it.
Yeah, right. So that is a sign that the full document is important and that people will read it. But in terms of having something that everybody will read, including the policymakers who are making the most important decisions, that shorter documents are helpful. All right, so the last thing I want to talk about are the things that we do to put a little pressure on policymakers, to create a little sense of buzz, right? So there isn't any advocacy campaign in the city that's going to have, thousands and thousands and thousands of people. It really could be as few as 10 or 20 people who can make a difference. And the question is, how do you make your 10 or 20 people look as important and as energetic and as if you actually reflect thousands and thousands of people? So it's a little bit of gamesmanship, maybe is the right word, or just creative strategies to create some sense of buzz. So what's among the things that we do to try to raise the visibility of an issue, clearly if you can put out a little bit of research, that's helpful. If you could do a forum, briefings, either across the community, so if you could do something in a library in every ward of the city on why we need a cultural plan, policymakers will know that's happening. Council members will probably send staff people there. If you have people come, they're like, oh, people care about this issue. If you can get news coverage or an op-ed in the Washington Post or any other local community paper, policymakers will read that as well. And they say, oh, someone wrote an op-ed about it, it must be an important issue. We also do forums right inside the Wilson building. So we will say, oh, today we're going to have a conversation about a cultural plan and why that's terrific for the District of Columbia. And we're going to have one council member be a panelist, as well as people from the community, or Joy or Jerome or somebody, it's one of you. And again, the fact that that's happening in the Wilson building and you're handing out a flyer to every single council office gives them a sense that, oh, something's going on here, people are talking about this. If you have spokespeople, all of you and any other folks in your network who can make sure that whenever you see a policymaker, you come up to them and you say, oh, I heard there's a cultural plan that's about to come out yet, I heard it hasn't come out yet, I hope it comes out soon. Whatever it is your message would be, if they've gone through a day or maybe a week or a month where some people have come up to talk to them about a cultural plan, there's been a briefing about the cultural plan, there may be an op-ed about a cultural plan, right? At that point, when they're hearing it from multiple different places, that's when you give them the sense, the impression, that this is an important issue that they need to be paying attention to, right? You've been bringing it up, making sure that it's coming up in a variety of different venues. And that's not easy and it's time intensive, but I guarantee you that it pays off. To the extent that you can also hold individual policymakers accountable if they promise something or they're responsible and they're holding things up, that also helps. So I'll give you an example there. So in our campaign for unemployment insurance, we had made what we thought was a rock solid case. Our benefits haven't changed in 10 years. They're lower than in 40 states. It's less than half the minimum wage, whatever our arguments were. We even have money in our unemployment insurance trust fund that will cover the cost, like it was just a slam dunk. And yet the council member in charge of that committee, Vincent Orange, for whatever reason, wasn't interested. So we started with a nice approach. We went to his office, we gave him our fact sheet, we made the compelling case, we said, boy, we hope you'll do this. And for whatever reason, he didn't want to do it. And I mention his name because it's important, like for stories, to make it as concrete as possible. I'm not saying he's a bad or good person. In this case, this just wasn't his top priority. So what we knew was coming up in a few months were hearings that every council committee has to have on the agencies they oversee. So there was going to be a hearing on the Department of Employment Services. And we, through our labor unions, identified 4 or 5 workers, so not a lot of people, but who could testify in front of that committee about why unemployment insurance benefits were too low and why the legislation that another council member had introduced should be passed. We told Mr. Orange that they were going to come and testify at his hearing. He was not happy to hear that because he knew that was going to make him look bad. He actually asked us to have them not testify. And you know, again, I'm naming him, but it's not that he's the only person doing it.
We want to know who the creeps
It's,
are.
well, you know, I'm not calling him a creep. More than there are other council members who might do the exact same thing.
They're creeps too.
But the good story, and the reason that you say he's not a creep, is that 2 months later, he was like telling the mayor, "Oh, we really need to make sure we put this in the budget." And it was really thanks to his advocacy with the mayor that we then got it. But it was just this little bit of pressure and publicly creating a sense of urgency for him. In this case, it wasn't having multiple different sources to create that sort of sense of urgency and buzz. It was just straight political pressure on him that we were going to make him look bad if he didn't address this issue, because we knew that he was the person who was responsible for it. Among the other things that we do is engage in the budget and policy process. So you know that every year in February and March, as I said, the council committees are required to have a hearing, an oversight hearing on every single agency in the district government. And then they're called performance oversight hearings, and they're an opportunity to testify about what an agency is doing well, what it's not doing well. But it's really an opportunity for you to say anything you want about that agency, including we think that they should be raising unemployment benefits. That's not really a performance issue, except just to point out that you run the unemployment insurance program and the benefits are too low. There also are, those hearings in February and March, and then in April and May, there are budget oversight hearings, which is after the mayor's budget has come out, which may or may not have what you want in it. That's an opportunity to go back to the council and say what's missing from the budget and what is needed. If you've been, it sounds like a lot of you folks have been through hearings like that before. Raise your hand if you've testified. All right, yeah, so you know the game. Again, if you can, the more people you can line up to testify, the better, and the more that you can get everyone to have the same talking points. Council members will get a little frustrated after they've heard the 10th person say the exact same thing, but I guarantee you it sends a signal. So it sends a signal to them that this issue is important and that people care about it. So I can give you an example there. We passed paid family leave legislation last December. It's a really good bill. It will give parents 8 weeks of leave if they have a child, moms and dads, 6 weeks of paid leave if they have to care for a sick relative, or 2 weeks if they themselves need to take time off from work. It's all passed and ready to go, but the business community is not all that happy about it because there's a tax attached to it that they have to pay. And as a result of that, Chairman Mendelson allowed a variety of other bills to be introduced that would, in our opinion, repeal and replace paid family leave. We're very concerned about these alternative bills. And Chairman Mendelson had a hearing just 2 weeks ago, and there were over 100 witnesses, and 80 to 90% of the witnesses were all in favor of keeping what we've got and not supporting the alternatives. The hearing started at 11. It didn't get over until 9 o'clock at night. And the fact that people stayed was a clear sign to Chairman Mendelson that people care about this issue. They don't want him to mess with their paid family leave. And if he does, there'll be consequences. So I don't expect you guys to line up 100 people to testify at a hearing, but if it's 3, 4, or 5 people and they're spread out over a couple panels, I guarantee you will get the council member's attention, and it will make it easier to then set a follow-up meeting with the council member to talk about the issue. We also engage in sign-on letters. Again, another place where numbers count. So if you can have a one-page sign-on letter that makes the case for why a cultural plan is important, why it needs to be produced, why it needs to be funded, how much it needs to be funded for, and you can get every organization that's represented in this room and others to sign on, and you're going creatively to think through the various constituencies who might care about this, I guarantee you that the council members will pay attention to that as well. It's not that hard to sign on to a letter, and they know that, but if they see that 100 organizations or even 50 organizations have signed on to that, then they know that it's a sign that it's an important issue. So it's a very common tactic that we have done. Of course, you want to meet directly with the policymakers as well, so setting up a meeting ideally with the council member, if you can. Most often you'll end up with a staff person, but even if you meet with the council staff person, as you know if you've done it, the message usually does get to their boss. They will hear that a meeting was had. Of course, meeting with the executive branch, folks in the mayor's office, If you have an opportunity, what you're looking for is budget related, you also need to get to know the council budget office. So there's 10 people or so who work for the DC Council who do the budget analysis and budget support work for council members. They also feed a lot of ideas and tell council members, oh, if you want to do X, here's how you might be able to do it. If you need money, here's where you might find it. So they have a lot of, they're just staff, but they have a lot of influence over the budget process. So going in to talk to Jen Budoff, who's the head of the council budget office, so that she knows about your issue is a really important thing, because you might convince 2 or 3 council members that it's an interesting issue. If they go talk to her about it and she hasn't heard about it before, she may not exactly know what to do or how to help them out. If you've talked to them as well, then if you've talked to the council budget office, then you've prepped them, and they might be your allies, because they're people, they're DC residents as well. If you make a compelling case to them, even though their job is really just to staff the council, they might become people who care about your issue as well. As I said, don't let them pressure you to find the money, because that's not your job. I guess the last thing on my notes here that I haven't, or one of the last things that I've talked about, is that a lot of what we do in our work is try to build relationships with policymakers and understand that they're people, that they might have children, or they might have elderly relatives, or they might have their own priorities, they might be coming up for re-election, they might be in a neighborhood where a school needs to be renovated. So when you're coming to them, you've got an issue, you want them to do something for you, that's very transactional, right? And if you have enough pressure and a compelling case, a transactional conversation can be okay. But if you can build a relationship with them where they know you, you know them, they care about you, you're bringing an issue to them isn't just, I want you to do this for me, it's, hey, we're working together, we like each other, we're supporting each other. So when I go to a council member or a staff member, I don't start with, oh, I want to tell you about my issue. I start with, oh, what's going on in your committee? Or knowing that if there's a particular bill that they've been focused on, to just chat them up a little bit about that, to give them a moment to talk about what's important to them. Because you are not, of course, the only, in addition to their own interests, they're hearing from other people as well. You are not the only group that's going to come talk to them about funding priorities. So acknowledging that they have other interests and other pressures, getting a sense of what's important to them, maybe even figuring out a way that what you want can help support some of their other goals. Those kinds of conversations and relationships will be helpful. We definitely hear from some policymakers that say, oh, you only come to us when you want something, or you only come to visit us at budget season, and we don't ever see you otherwise. They don't say that to us because we try not to do that. But that's clearly a sign that they're looking for a relationship, and they're looking for you doing something to help them, not just you telling them what you want them to do for you. So to the extent that you can spend time doing that, if you've been in the Wilson Building, you know that just spending half a day in the Wilson Building, even if you don't have meetings, just standing in one spot in the hallway and waiting for who's going to walk by, because people will walk by, they need to use the bathroom, they go to committee hearings, they go for lunch. We have more conversations with council members probably from those kind of just stopping them in the hallway than scheduled meetings. So Chairman Mendelson, for example, my guess is if you called him today, his office, to try to schedule something, they might put you on the calendar 2 or 3 months down the road. But if you go to his office, which is right here, and then it's across the hallway is the bathroom right there, if you know, seriously, if you know he's in the office and you are just willing to stand there for an hour, he's going to come use the bathroom. And if you stop him, he will talk to you for 5 minutes. He will not be, he will have a meeting with you in the hallway. And that might be the way to get your meeting 3 months earlier than it otherwise would be. And the same thing is true with other policymakers. If you just camp out in the Wilson Building, and it can be as little as a couple hours or half a day, I guarantee you will have multiple very useful conversations, might be in the hallway, that you might have a hard time if you try to call people and schedule those meetings in advance.
So, given that, just a question on that.
Yeah.
If you're the same person doing it all the time, should you have a little team?
Team is good. Yeah, no, I think, I mean, to the extent that you're trying, not everyone's going to be available every day, and different people might have different relationships with different people in the Wilson Building. So yeah, it's always good to have a team. So now that I'm looking at you, did I answer your question? Or your earlier question?
I'm hearing some answers
hearing
to that.
something,
You know,
yeah.
the building relationships
Yeah.
is very important in partnerships, and
Yeah.
how can we help one another get what we both want to get done while
Yeah.
it might be different. So
That's right. Yeah.
yeah, but you know, politicians, there are probably, some key things that are not pretty obvious about them that you in your experience have developed, sort of a toolkit for
Yes.
how to approach and twist arms without breaking them.
That's good. Twist arms without breaking. Policymakers want their main goal, if you're an elected official, is to get reelected, right? And everything they do is seen through that lens. And every day, their life is out in the public, right? What they do, people see. If I go to the office one day and I just sort of slack off and I'm not very productive, no one's going to necessarily notice. But if you're a policymaker, your life is exposed. And so you want to do things that are going to make them look good in public as much as possible. So make them the hero for funding your cultural plan. You want to, but you also want to embarrass them at times, but that should not be the first thing you go to. The first thing you're doing is making demands and saying shame on you or whatever. You're not going to make friends. You're not going to build a relationship. If the first thing you can do is to make them the hero for championing what you can do, that's a better approach. As I said, this example that we had with Councilmember Orange, we thought we were going to make him the champion to say, hey, you can increase unemployment benefits for thousands of people and there's already the money in the bank to do it. Why don't you do it and take credit? And I still am surprised that he didn't do it because it would have been an easy political win for him, something that he could have taken credit for. And it was only when the nice approach didn't work that we decided to put the more public embarrassment approach on.
What about significant others of the politicians? I don't mean family members, but other people who talk with them, doing some research and finding out who those people are and going through them, sort of like a back door.
So the question was, who else knows the policymakers? And you mentioned relatives, and I would broaden it to that. So what you're raising is a concept known as power mapping. And power mapping is getting a sense of who are the people who have the influence over the decision that you care about, and then who influences them. So, clearly, as you're saying, you could go straight to the policymaker and say, this is a really great idea. Or you could go to people who influence that policymaker. It might be someone who endorsed them in the last campaign, a union or somebody else. It might be a campaign contributor, or it might be their pastor, if you know their pastor, or somebody else in their lives. Or it might be an ANC commissioner who's really active in that community, in that ward, whose opinion really matters to the policymaker. We are doing something just along those lines with paid family leave. As I said, something's been passed that we think is great. There are other bills that are being considered that would replace it with something worse. Chairman Mendelson is in control. He's not particularly fond of the DC Fiscal Policy Institute right now, so we're not going to go talk to him. But I know somebody who used to work for him, who worked on his campaigns, who has a good relationship with him, who I have a good relationship with, and I'm going to talk to that person and say, hey, do you think you can do something with Mr. Mendelson to convince him to do the right thing on these bills? So to the extent that you can figure out what matters to these people. I don't know about going straight to their spouses, that only if you know them, but to give you an example where that is relevant, I don't think it's crossing too many boundaries of privacy, is that David Grosso's wife is very interested in women's rights issues. And that's one reason that he's very interested in reproductive rights and other sorts of issues. So to the extent that you're raising, I don't know if the cultural plan is one that would fall along those lines, but knowing that she's interested in that, that might be a way, and she's very active through her work on women's issues, you could engage her, not to go straight to her boss, but just to educate her about what you're working on, which then maybe you could come up in a conversation with her husband later on. I do want to spend a few minutes talking specifically about the concept of dedicated funding, because that's the concept that both you raised. Dedicated funding sounds like a great thing. I'm actually going to say why I don't necessarily think it's a great thing. So dedicated funding usually says we're going to take, the first penny from the sales tax and we're going to put it into arts programs, or we're going to take whatever, some particular revenue source and dedicate it to this program. And it sounds great. And it is a convincing way to help a policymaker understand if you're raising this revenue, it's going to create this benefit. So that's why it's appealing. And I think that's why a lot of people do gravitate towards that, towards creating some sort of dedicated funding. But there are lots of risks as well, and there also aren't any guarantees. So to give you an example, the Housing Production Trust Fund, which is the main tool to build affordable housing in the city, has a dedicated funding source. 15% of taxes, transfer taxes when buildings are bought and sold, deed recordation, deed transfer taxes goes to the Housing Production Trust Fund, and that's both commercial properties and homes. And that sounds like a great thing. We've got this dedicated funding source that's going into affordable housing. Well, do you guess what happened the economy was doing quite well in 2007 and 2008, and then guess what happened in 2009? The economy tanked, home values dropped, and the volume of real estate sales dropped by 2/3. So as a dedicated funding source that had been here, 2 years later it was 2/3 less. And we went to the council and said, you would never, and the mayor, you would never cut any program by 2/3 in 2 years that you think is a good program, right? And the answer we got back was, well, you all advocated for a dedicated funding source. We're going to give you the dedicated funding source. You're not going to get anything more. And you see that in other cases where this was a long time ago when states started creating lotteries, unfortunately. They often sold the idea of a lottery by saying all the money's going to go to schools. And it sounds great, right? Oh, well, this makes a lottery more acceptable because the money's going to go to schools. Well, let's say your schools currently get $1 billion and a lottery raises $100 million. Do you think next year the schools got 1.1 billion? No, they got $1 billion. It just happened to be 100 million came from the lottery, and that freed up 100 million that was currently going to schools to go to other things. So it didn't even necessarily increase the funding. And it also, because lottery revenues decline over time, it also meant that schools were not necessarily going to be getting increasing funding from year to year. So it's a dangerous thing to get involved in. And some of the most important things that are funded in the city that no one would ever consider cutting, police, schools, none of those have dedicated funding sources. They're just appropriated in the budget every year. So I think the more important thing for you to do is to make a really strong case for what you want and how much you want it to be, and get it in the budget. And once you've gotten it in the budget, whatever that dollar amount is, every year the budget goes up and down and could be cut, but it will be in there as a baseline, and it by and large will be protected. Most years, most things in the budget, most programs are maintained. It's very rare that a program gets cut unless it's a recession and then everything gets cut. Once you get it in the budget, and even if it's not a dedicated funding source, it's relatively protected as long as you continue to demonstrate that it's a good program. So I think dedicated funding sounds like a great answer, maybe sounds like a quick answer when it doesn't substitute for good advocacy, for making having a good network, making a compelling case with your materials, doing enough activities to show that the community really cares about this program, finding a champion on the council who then puts the money in the budget and then defends it year after year after year. And it's even if it's dedicated funding, you're still going to have to defend it year after year after year. It's maybe easier once it's in the budget to keep it there, but you should never assume that it's always going to be there. So I'm not saying you shouldn't pursue dedicated funding, but I would be very wary of doing that depending on what the funding source is, and that I would spend more time just making the basic case for what's needed and how much and why the amount that you want is the right amount that needs to be funded. I think if you do all those things, I don't know if that sounded overwhelming to you. Those are the keys. They are not, again, guaranteed to provide success, but every campaign that we've had that created success had some element of those, some combination of those tools, and it always reflected some changing of strategies or some evolution of our strategies from year to year to build on what worked or respond to what hadn't worked in the year before. And so if you do all those things, I hope you have great success. I'm happy to be supportive in any of these activities as you move forward, and also happy to take any more questions.
I have a question on tactics. There is a larger umbrella group in the city of which Humanities DC is a part, and the DC Living Heritage Network is a part. It's called Arts Action DC. And on this whole question of relationship building, I think this fall, they shifted they found out it wasn't enough just to go to the performance hearing, the budget hearings. It needed to start earlier in the cycle, meaning they had some activities this fall. Is that correct, Julia?
Yeah.
We're planning to have a fall advocacy as well as a spring.
So a fall advocacy as well as a spring advocacy to kind of keep the issues out there.
Yes, I think that's a great strategy, and it's what a lot of organizations do. So the budget process in DC happens in the spring. really gets going in March through June, but people start paying attention to the budget maybe in January or February. If you wait until January or February to have your goals and communicate your goals, it is probably too late. So having events in the fall that bring attention to your issue, again, to show that there's community support, community interest, that help policymakers even see specifically what you want them to do, so that when January comes, they're more able to communicate that message. So the mayor is the one who develops the budget, the first take at the budget, but the mayor also takes feedback not only from the community but from every single council member as well. So every council member will send a letter to the mayor saying, when you put your budget together, I really hope you do X, Y, or Z. So if you have developed those relationships and helped make the case this fall, so that when January comes and a council member's thinking, what are the 5 things that I'm going to ask the mayor to do to put cultural plan on the top, on that list, means you have to be doing some of that work now, or the more work you do now, the more likely it'll be on their list then.
What are your thoughts about paid lobbyists?
What about paid lobbyists? I honestly don't know the answer because I don't know them.
Using them to help with your mission, because they tend to have these relationships already in place.
Yeah, I don't. It depends on who it is and what the relationships are. I think that if I were going to pay somebody, what I would do, my personal feeling is the council member should know you, right? They shouldn't know your lobbyists. They should know you, right? They should care about you, and they should know all the great work you do at Humanities DC, and that you're building on that relationship. Paid lobbyists could do that. I think if I had money to spend on something like that, I would hire a communications consultant rather than a lobbyist, right? Somebody who can help you think through the right messaging, put it together, compelling, good-looking materials. It's a one-time cost, and you don't need them to go over and over again to the Wilson Building. That would be my instinct. But I don't. In the advocacy world, nobody has any money to pay. In the nonprofit advocacy world, nobody hires paid lobbyists, so I don't know enough about how that works. Yes.
About a couple of weeks ago, I happened to catch you and a colleague give a presentation at the City First Community Finance Development Conference. And you brought up some really sobering statistics about the wealth disparities in the district. They were very, very sobering. I don't know if you want to mention that for a second. That's not my main question. It's really the context in which you delivered those comments. One thing that at least from the other side of the river, let's say in Anacostia and greater Anacostia Ward 8 area, I've been seeing is something, I don't know if it's a disruptive force in terms of the relationship building, in terms of advocacy that you're talking about. It seems like we're here, grassroots, moving up, trying to get our ideas out. But there seems to be a new force or initiative coming from the top down, so to speak, and that's the issue of elevating equity and equitable development. So I want, if you could, to just spend a few words talking about how policymakers are reacting to this movement by businesses to help people stay in areas. I got a recent email from one of these groups that are participating in equitable development to weigh in on the cultural plan. So I'm just wondering how all of this is affecting our ability to advocate.
It's a great question. I think that to the extent you can link them, you should. So the statistic you're talking about, I think, was done by Kilolo Kijikazi, who's an analyst at Urban Institute, and found that the median black household in the district has assets of $3,500. So that's half of all black households have assets of $3,500 or less, compared to the median white household that has assets of close to $300,000. A lot of that's home value, but it's other things as well. And that is a stark reminder of what racism and discrimination over the years have done to prevent black households across the country, but here in DC, from building wealth, from getting good jobs, getting good education, getting the kind of jobs that might help them buy a house and start to build that wealth. And of course, now we have an economy that's taking off, business opportunities that are arising left and right. But if you don't have any assets, you're not going to be the one to start those businesses, right? So to the extent that you're talking about preserving the city's cultural heritage, and a lot of that heritage is the black community, because we had been a majority black city for so many decades. If you can link the economics to how cultural preservation is part of overall economic preservation as well. We need to not only invest in affordable housing to help keep people here, we also need to invest in cultural heritage so that we can tell their stories about what they've contributed to the city and the things that are at risk if we don't invest in things to help families stay in the city. In terms of the response, I mean, I like the equitable development argument. I don't know, and I think some policymakers are responding to that as well. There's always a question in my mind on the cynical side of, are they going to put their money where their mouth is, right? So you could talk to someone who's running for office who will talk deeply about making sure that everyone, that families who have lived here for generations and generations sooner get pushed out. And then when push comes to shove, are they going to really put the money into affordable housing? Are they going to stop the tax cuts that are making it harder to fund schools? That's where the advocacy is needed, to actually remind them of the good things that they said, and that their actions actually, that they take the tough votes to do the things that they know are right, that they campaign on. So I think that's sort of, again, why I think your advocacy is important, and it would be good to link up with the economic challenges that are displacing a lot of people and challenging the city's cultural diversity. So I have I'm happy to take more questions, but I also have some shameless promotion that I want to do. So I'm going to hand out, it's not very neat yet because we're just getting some postcards I can ask Jerome. So you can follow me and the DC Fiscal Policy Institute on Twitter if you're Twitter followers, and that will be on the list there. You also can follow us on Facebook, and that's just DC Fiscal Policy Institute. And we also, on that sheet of paper, talk about our blog. So the DC Fiscal Policy Institute puts out a lot of research to tell the stories and talk about all the things that I've talked about today. One of our main vehicles to do that is through a blog where we post 2 or 3 times a week. They're very short, about a page long, and it's easy. You can go on your phone now if you want to, or when you get home, to sign up for that blog. And it's, again, an easy way, if you liked what you heard today and you think what we have is interesting information, to get it in digestible bites on a regular basis. And we'll let you know through our blog about any other major reports, any major developments, things happening in the budget, hopefully things that will help inform your advocacy as well. So I hope you'll sign up. Yeah.
How does one go about getting an op-ed published? I mean, how do you, are there clear steps, or is there a process or procedure for that?
Getting an op-ed published. So there aren't that many places to submit an op-ed, so the question is where to go. So there's the Post Local Opinions, which takes 3 or 4 stories every week. There's the Washington Informer, the Northwest Current, occasionally the City Paper. I think the key is to write something that's not too long. So an op-ed should probably be around 500 words or so. It should be more than just your opinion, but have enough factual information that it's persuasive on its own. If you're writing it about something that I might have some expertise on, having someone who's done it before might be helpful. I'd be happy to review it, having somebody else review it with you. And then there's a lot of just crossing your fingers after you've submitted it, hoping that they will find it interesting enough that you'll run it. I mean, one of the reasons we have the blog is because we can't get everything that we wanted published as a news article or as an op-ed in the Post, so we publish it ourselves. Yeah, I'm happy to talk with you more about it. There isn't any magic to it other than knowing where the sources are and giving them something that is small and short enough and concisely written enough. The other place that takes op-eds is the Capital Community News, the Hill Rag, East of the River, and Mid-City News. Those free monthly publications have opinion pieces in them as well. Okay.
Thank you very much, Ed.
Thank you.
That was quite a checklist. So, is it guaranteed success? Yes. Great. We only have a couple minutes left, so we scheduled from 4 to 5:30. So maybe I could ask Joy just to come up, stand next to me, and give a quick update on Arts Action and your conversations with the Office of Planning.
So I had a conversation with Sakina Khan, who is the Deputy Director in the Office of Planning, yesterday. And I think you know that a lot of our efforts over the last couple of years have been focused on making sure that humanities, heritage, and preservation are in the cultural plan. And so she's now saying that it'll come out next month. It was due out sometime, I think, in January, so they've had a lot of delays. But something in her voice suggested that this is going to happen very soon. And we are definitely hoping, because we put a lot of effort into this and a lot of good thinking from Jerome and others, to make sure that humanities, heritage, and preservation are in the cultural plan, because we see that as a way to make sure that our advocacy pays off in the years to come and that we get the support we need for these activities. I can tell you that when the bill was first proposed, none of those 3 words were in the plan, were in the bill. And so we worked really hard to make sure that that has happened. And as I was thinking about what Ed was saying, I have been in City Council, and we've been attending the City Council hearings for at least 4 or 5 years, every year. And it was always a focus on the arts. And so I could never get them to also use the humanities. Now, I cannot tell you that all 13 of them say humanities every time they talk, but enough of them, including Grosso and including Jack Evans, who are the people who are most, and my council member Todd, for example, who are quite interested in these issues and quite interested in making sure that people who have lived in the city a long time can tell their stories, do refer to the humanities. So I think that was a win for us over the years, and struck by Ed's insistence on the kind of materials and also the very short time that you have to tell. So I was really pleased with some of the practical things that he gave that we are, and Agatha is a big proponent of our advocacy, are also working to do. Okay, so then Arts Action. So Arts Action, I'm on the steering committee of Arts Action, and I'm on some other committees where they are looking at bills and the possibility of dedicated funding going forward. And some of you who are in this audience know that the Arts Advocacy had its biggest advocacy event in the spring. Perry, you were among those. And
Spring of 2017.
In the spring of 2017. And so 200 arts organization members showed up. That was huge for the arts community. And I have to tell you that at least a fifth of those people were from this DC Living Heritage Network. So we are having impact. And we're going to continue to do that and make sure that's done. And what we were just talking about is that the Arts Advocacy is promoting a fall advocacy program as well. And so we'll be calling on all of you to get engaged. And Joyce Wellman, in addition to being is a board member, but she's also a mayor's representative on our board. And so we're also looking for leadership from her as well. So
When you
thanks,
say our
Joyce.
board, what board are you?
The Humanities Council. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you all for coming, and we'll be around. We're here to answer your questions, and we'll let you know about our next upcoming events. When the draft of the plan, cultural plan comes out, we will be holding special sessions on it to vet it.